So today we're looking at a very particular issue, and the name of it, or sort of a name that we give to this mix of elements, is asymmetric war. And I'm curious, how many of you have heard of this term? And how many of you know actually what it is, which is not always the same as having heard of it? You don't know what it is? Did you all hear this or not? In other words, asymmetric war, which is a term, now a bit of a term of art, as they say in the business. And it is an emergent term. You know, it is something that has arisen out of some of the recent wars, notably the Iraq war, that the United States sort of launched and engaged in. And it does describe the encounter between a regular army and irregular combatants. Now, let me say that the term irregular combatants is the kindest designation that we can give, the fairest, if you want, that we could give to those irregular combatants. There are many other terms that are used, you know, which come with negative connotations. Historically speaking, we know that this type of mix of regular army and irregular combatant have been part, very often, of freedom struggles. That mode is not a mode that comes to mind when we talk about today's asymmetric wars. And asymmetric war is not something that we have used to describe those past, freedom struggles that were done by irregular combatants, basically. So there is a very long history of irregular combatants confronting regular armies. What begins to happen, I would say, 20 years ago, maybe even a bit more, but certainly 20 years ago, is a whole new mode of it, which, of course, the war on Iraq, as I said, really launched. In many ways, the war in Vietnam had many elements of that kind of asymmetric war, but it was still much more of a regular war. So today, when we say asymmetric war, it could mean some of the terrorist attacks that have happened in some cities. For instance, in Paris, those are probably among the best known. In the US, with some aspects of it, though much less so than in some of the major European cities. Now, look at this image. So this image has tanks in it, and later on I'll show another image that's just a bit more, and then it has people standing around, and then it has people praying. Now, these tanks were being mobilized. This was the famous, the Tahrir Square events in Egypt, remember, in Cairo? Do people, who knows about the Tahrir Square? Most of you know? Not most of you. Okay, that was a moment when there was a major uprising by, mostly students, young people, etc., not necessarily armed. Eventually, some of them got armed. And so I have a few images and a few comments that I'll get to later on what happens in Tahrir Square. So Tahrir Square was an example of a massive mobilization of people who were just demonstrating, and then wind up, at least some of them, becoming, in quotation marks, irregular combatants, which legitimated the regular army to sort of shoot them down, put them in jail, torture them, etc. That is a real extreme version of this notion of, these kinds of asymmetric wars. But the truth of the matter is that when you use the term, you wind up with a whole series of instances that are made up of particular instantiations, if you want. There is no such thing as a typical model. There isn't. They happen in many, many different ways. Some of you may remember it got a lot of attention, the Fallujah War in Iraq, remember? There, the American army, so well armed, huge tanks, huge planes, huge, I don't know what all, guns and everything else, they had the hardest time fighting the irregular combatants who were in Fallujah. So the irregular combatants can, in certain operational spaces, acquire a significant advantage. And now I'll elaborate a bit more as we proceed. Now, so this is the term, asymmetric war. Now, so here are a few questions that I want to insert in your brains so that you sort of to problematize the whole issue. This is a very ambiguous zone. And one item, and that is extremely pertinent to this class, is that asymmetric war very often is an urbanizing of war. It happens in cities. Now, remember the big truck in Nice that ran, how many, nobody? So, yeah, okay. That sort of ran into this boulevard in southern France in the beautiful city called Nice and just killed like 90 people. That is also an instance of asymmetric war. So in Paris, we have had several of those incidents. So I just want to I want you to keep that in mind. It is not just always a well-armed, irregular army. It is also that. So the concept is pretty broad. What hangs in there to a rather extreme measure, which has, I think, surprised a lot of experts, is the extent to which the space of the city is a very good space for that kind of encounter or for launching, a certain type of attack. Now, so here we begin with these questions now. Does the urbanizing of war, okay, you now know what I mean by that, right? Make legible the limits of military superiority and of war itself. Let's just take military superiority. What is signaled in that little sentence? In other words, does the urbanizing of war, in other words, that war happens in a city, and war doesn't mean like World War II kind of stuff, make legible the limits of military superiority? Here are cases that actually happened. And again, Vietnam was one side, but then Iraq became a critical side, where the American military actually changed its strategies, added a whole new world of learning from the lessons that they experienced, if you want, from the initial attacks in some of the Iraqi cities. So one image that you might have and that you might have seen in newspapers a few years ago is the big tanks, the apparel of a modern, in quotation marks, state-of-the-art army. They don't help you very much if you're entering a city with multiple, an old city with multiple little alleys, etc. What are you going to do with a big tank? You are just an object that you immediately can shoot down. It doesn't help. So that's a very simple example, but that's an example that has recurred. Now, I will also want to emphasize now that starting with whatever this very prolonged war that happened in Iraq, the American army set up encampments, like some on the West Coast, etc., where you had whatever space, in order to train for those kinds of wars. The Israeli army has long been doing this, right? So the Israeli army, some of you may know that, developed a tactic where when it invaded in mostly Palestinian settlements, when it wanted to invade one, it wouldn't go on the streets. It went through the buildings. Some of you must know this or not. And it made holes. They very quickly could make, those are old structures. They are not, steel. And they would go inside one house, make a hole in the wall that connects to the next wall, make a hole that connects to the next wall. So a parallel zone rather than the street where they could immediately be shot down. So I'm just mentioning all of these little things to open up your minds to a setting that we don't see easily in a city like New York, let's say, but that in many parts of the world are in fact in play. So the notion of makes legible the limits of military superiority is that a lot of the armaments of the contemporary significant armies, they don't help you. They just don't. Second, extremely important point. When you have a bunch of hegemons, hegemonic powers starting a war, they can at some point say, okay, enough of war, let's go back to business. Look at World War I and World War II. They each lasted about 5 years. And then the hegemonic powers decided, okay, enough of that, we sign an agreement, it's imperfect, doesn't matter, end of war. That is not an option. The Iraq War for the United States has really been trying to get out of it, so to speak, is still going on. More than 11 years. The irregular combatants will not give up. And so the only mode in that kind of setting would be total withdrawal. And somehow the United States is not ready to do that. Whether that is a smart decision or not a smart decision is another matter. But there is no option for hegemonic powers to sit to decide, okay, enough. That is a major feature, if you want, of this type of war. And they go on and on. And cities, directly and indirectly, are operational zones in this type of war, because the irregular combatants benefit from an urban setting in a way that a regular state-of-the-art army with huge cannons and huge, well, not cannons, tanks, and I don't know what all, does not. You had a question? The example you mentioned is World War II. Why there were no insurgencies? Is that what you're saying? Sort of, there actually were, but they got killed very quickly. Partly because when we talk about irregular combatants, they are combatants. Whereas in the case, say, of Germany, in Berlin there were actually little uprisings. They tried also to kill Hitler and all of that. But those were not irregular combatants. Irregular combatants know how to fight. These were often intellectuals or a general who may have always been sitting at a desk, rather than doing much. But it is a good question. There were always people who were trying to change something in these wars, the World War I and World War II. But again, I want to emphasize both of these big world wars each lasted about 5 years. And that is not happening today. Now, so one language that we can use, and it really means a very partial insertion in urban space, is that asymmetric war wires war into urban space. Now, if you look at Germany and you look at France, there have been several incidents of little interventions that have managed to kill a few people, and some not so few. Same thing with London. It also is about terror. You terrify a population. So you have certain big open events that no longer are done because it becomes dangerous. There are many, many interventions. And in that sense, asymmetric war wires war into urban space. It's not always about combat. It is many other ways. You put a barrier here, you put a barrier there, etc., etc. Now, third element. Question is, does it make the city itself a technology of war that obstructs the power of conventional armies in multiple ways? You can understand that question, right? Yes? Okay, very good, thank you. Now, these letters came out big. So one way of putting it, can the physics, think of the term physics as an open-ended term that can bring in stuff, okay? Sort of an algorithm that can be constructed, made. So can the physics of civil society, as instantiated in a city, you know the term instantiated, right? As it manifests itself, as it embeds itself in a city, obstruct war, actually be a deterrent to war, all right? Even if such physics cannot prevent war. Now here I invite you to, do you understand this is not such a simple sentence, I realize it's not a very well constructed sentence, but do you know what I'm saying or not? Not really? All right, So civil society, right? Civil society is not just something, it's not like a tree. Civil society is a mix of elements that partially inhabit the imaginations of residents, that partly manifest in whatever certain public interventions, you know. So civil society has been with us for a very long time. It's a very powerful element. It's partial, it's movable, you can't quite see it, but you can see the consequences, etc. So if we take it seriously, now here I make a footnote. Manhattan today has lost a lot of its capacity to somehow embody civil society. Certainly Midtown and Lower Manhattan. You have all these big towers. I talked already about them, right? That are sort of half empty. It sort of de-urbanizes, actually. But think of a city that you still have a very crowded, like Lower Manhattan still has it. You know, I mean, there is a lot of stuff happening there. And one element of that is some sort of notion of civil society. When you have fairs and you have big parties, when late at night all the parties, I live in Lower Manhattan, so I see these masses of people that all go to various places where you can party in a way that I don't think you can party around Columbia University, but you correct me if I'm wrong. So here the question of civil society is this ambiguous something that actually is critical to urbanity. You know, and it's civil. It's not military, it's not religious, it's civil. It's sort of the civic, if you want. Now, even if such physics, blah, blah, cannot prevent war, can they do something? Does it make a difference? And I'm just going to move on now because we'll get to some of these examples. Here's an example. Does the fact of schools and hospitals, people and homes, become a condition that keeps the enemy from pulverizing a whole city? Now here we're talking regular war. Now we know from various wars that not really, it doesn't really keep them from pulverizing. I mean, but at the same time when you look at World War II, which is something that most people are familiar with, there was a huge debate. Do we bomb Paris out of existence or not? The Nazis were occupying Paris. They decided not to. I just want you to take that in, not that the Nazis were nice, they were not, whatever there is there. But there was some, it's the speech, if you want, the capacity, those civic physics embedded in Paris. No, because somehow Paris, a city like Paris, it is all of us. A city like Paris, you know, a city like London, a city. So there is something about that capacity of the city to say, we don't want to destroy it completely. Now, I want to juxtapose that to, maybe I have it here, no, I have it later on. The way we handle massive death of people in poor areas. We are right now witnessing stuff that approaches genocides. A bit invisible, nobody talks about it very much, like in Congo, for instance, and a few other places. Whereas if it happens in a city, 3 people killed by a truck who is a militarized, a truck that aims at killing, it's a major event, major. So there is something about the city with all its civic elements, etc., that somehow, you know, it has the capacity to sort of say, wait a minute before you blow me up to pieces. There is something, and historically we see that. Now let me give you a very simple example. When the big Buddhas were destroyed, remember these huge in Cambodia? People were horrified. It was like major assassination of I don't know what. I was also horrified, by the way. What is it, 6 million people who have died in Congo from disease, from war? No. It's like people barely know that. So the urban space, the city, has a capacity, and I like to use language, it's a bit theoretical. It has speech. It tells something that people sort of take seriously. You know, that it hampers sort of a a simplification of the horror. So I invite you to think a bit about that. Now, so does this signal that under certain conditions, the powerlessness of the unarmed citizens, civil society in a city, can become complex? I.e., we decided not to destroy Paris. We were horrified when the 2 towers were blown down. Unacceptable, cannot be. The 6 million who died in Congo, we just don't talk about it. It's the same thing you could say if a beautiful old painting is cut into pieces. It sort of generates a global horror. Now, that painting likely is going to be in a city, everybody knows about it, etc. So there is something about urban space that can really have speech and say, this not. Now, what the horror is that so much of what happens in rural areas lacks that speech. I think it should, of course, also have that kind of speech. When I say speech, it's a bit of a theorized way of speaking. Do you understand what I mean, right? That it's a kind of, if people are horrified when 3 people are killed by a terrorist in London, you can say the city has speech. The city makes that into a major event. If it were out in the fields, poof, nobody would notice. Now I have repeated myself about 3 times on that one, hoping that it is all clear. Now here are 2 major themes, 2 major sort of when you think about cities and asymmetric war. Now, maybe I didn't quite clarify, the main forms of war in today's world are asymmetric war. It is not that France and Germany are going to go to war, or the United States and Japan. We do witness the possibility with our new president that he blows North Korea out of the picture, and hence North Korea would blow the US out of the picture, but somehow it seems a bit, a bit remote. Anyhow, the multiple meanings of the new urban wars. Asymmetric war urbanizes armed conflict. US Army training for the urban enemy, this is now a feature. Forms of economic violence that kill. When the horrors of asymmetric war always leave out the economics that is also killing, the poverty, the whatever, the overworking. Cities and urban space as a technology for war for the irregular combatant. The irregular combatant would not be strong if she couldn't use the city. This we have established very clearly in Fallujah and in several other wars in Iraq, conflicts in Iraq. Reappropriating the city of fear, the city, this. So this is an issue that in Europe, in Paris, London, and also a bit in Germany, there were some very nasty attacks there. The resisting to, we have to be careful because it's dangerous. There's a real resistance, and this is also sort of an urban mode. We are not going to stop going out in the street. We are not going to stop whatever, all the sort of public settings. So reappropriating the city of fear, making it again ours so that it is not the city of fear. Civil war refugees and their flight from and to cities. So this is, both things are happening, when you think about certain parts of the world. And then we also have the new kinds of gang wars. Now, the United States, I don't know if people some of you are too young, but there was a time when I was for 10 years in Chicago, the University of Chicago. I mean, you had people killed every night, or day for that matter. There were gang wars. So was New York City. Both of them are a bit better, but when you look at the numbers of people that are killed still in Chicago, it's very high. It's like 1,000 a year. That's what we count. Those who disappear in the river or whatever, we never hear of them. So the United States actually can support a kind of violence that is still not as common, I would say, in Europe. And the US has become just a bit better, which often really translates into the military becoming rather brutal. I mean, not the military, the police. Now, so does where you are killed matter? having said all of this stuff about the city, this becomes a question, right? Are certain forms of multiple death somehow more acceptable, less outrageous than others? All those people who are dying, you know, in the Congo is forever a good example. 800,000 die of malaria every year. The figures might be a bit better now, but not much. And there is a cheap cure. So this should be like a major issue. No, it isn't. What is a major issue is if 2 people are killed in London in a terrorist attack. I'm using that in quotation marks. So again, what is it about urban space? If it happens in urban space, it becomes global news, it becomes a major issue. If it's all those people who die in poor areas every year, innocent children, etc., etc., most people don't even know about it. Most people certainly don't think about it. Now, we paid much more attention to, these are tragic stories, clearly, to the 3,500, I can't remember if that is a precise figure now, because I know the figures were revised, in the World Trade Towers attack. But we don't mourn, again, those 6 million in Congo, just to mention one group. So I would argue that there is an intermediate vector that explains the difference. And that intermediate vector is urban space, is urbanity, is the city, it's that kind of thing. Now, take it in, and eventually I would love it if you could make it yours, because it is a bit of a theorized argument, but it actually, I think, captures a truth, if you want. Now, when cities confront conflict across time and space, cities have shown a capacity to transform conflict into the civic. The civic, I want to emphasize, in its multiple meanings. The civic has many different meanings. Commerce and mutual dependence are 2 critical elements that have played a role in the possibility of making it a collective effort, in the possibility of making the civic. Now, when you look at sort of historical records that go back, you know, often centuries, and here I'm thinking especially about cities in Europe. Europe was a continent of cities. You have a lot of very old cities that are sort of smallish cities, et cetera, very different from the US in that sense. Huh? And what you see is that these cities took themselves very seriously. You know that some of the earliest records that we have in the West on population issues, etc., were made by cities, but way back, I mean centuries ago. Anyhow, from those records we know that these cities take themselves very seriously. When you appear at the door of the city, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and made a claim, I would like to be part of this city, you were not immediately accepted. I want to also emphasize, given the immigration issue that we will talk about later in the class, that basically the one who arrived at your door was sort of your cousin. You know, they were not coming from very far. Same sort of culture, basically, same religion, same. But no was very often the answer in these small towns, that in medieval times and earlier. Now, this is a very important issue. When they accepted the foreigner, the outsider, etc., often what happened was a kind of expansion of rights for all. Now, I want to come back to some more recent immigration issues. In many of the European cities, when you have in the 1800s immigrants coming, often what happened was resistance, but we need them. All the big cities in Europe, Milano, Paris, the northern cities, they all needed migrant workers. So at the beginning, often it was, we don't, but yeah, but we need it, we take them. Eventually, those workers would start making claims for better conditions, for more public, say, in modernity, in the early 1900s, for public transport, for having access to transport. At that point, very often, in the European case, it's a bit different in the US, except for the big cities, but in the European case, what would happen is that the claims by these migrants for, say, access to public transport, access to medical, etc., would mean actually making it public. So when you have a whole, think the subway. When you have, the larger the population you're dealing with, the more difficult it becomes to see, well, let's see, are you entitled to use the subway? You were not born here, you are, you know, when you're dealing with 1 million, forget it. You just, everybody who has the ticket is yours. And now I'm simplifying a story that is a very complicated story, actually. But the point is that the foreigners arrive, they are not welcome, they are sort of suspicious, etc. But eventually it's the mass itself, that many people, that actually generalized, in the case of a lot of the European cities, the right to basic access to housing, to transport, to medical. The history in the United States has been different, but we actually had something along those lines. So again, the fact of a certain size of population begins to make it impossible to separate who's entitled and who's not. And let's take our subway here in New York. At the subway is not the place where they're going to stop you and ask, okay, show me your documents. They don't. So there are these urban infrastructures that handle vast masses of people, that have historically started with complicated constraints and, you know, that eventually, just to simplify life, they overwhelm all those other particularities, and you have basically a public transport system. You have a public health system. You have a public school system. You can't continuously, you know, be asking to demonstrate, do you have a claim? Am I hearing voices, or is that just me? Yeah. I am hearing voices. It's the room behind. Hi there, okay. I guess they are speaking louder because I am speaking very loudly. Poor thingies, they must really be suffering there. All right. Now, so have shown a capacity to transform conflict into the civic. In other words, what starts as conflict can become part of a larger configuration that we can call the civic. So what I said about transport, okay, so you also have access to transport. That's a very low-level civic, but still, it makes a difference. So in other words, the configuration of the city itself, masses of people, lots of, you know, people in need of sharing that transport, etc., it sort of enables a kind of civic. It's not a very, very high-quality civic necessarily. You know, it's a pretty elementary civic. Now, when you take the city confronting conflict, I just gave you an example, right, of a deeply urban thing. No, you cannot take the subway or whatever because you don't belong here, you're an irregular. Well, you know, we neutralize that eventually. In contrast, states, national states in our European history, confronted with conflict, have more easily gone to war. You know that the European continent, for a while there, had 600 plus separate states. This was a period when the rise of the state was an extraordinary phenomenon. Can you imagine what that was like? You know, so this notion of I control fully. Cities are a bit wobblier, huh? And well, anyhow, I have some stories, but I don't want to delay more. Now, one question that we must ask ourselves is today's cities, and again, I invite you to think Manhattan today, not the rest of New York City necessarily, but Manhattan. And I'm thinking especially about Midtown and Lower Manhattan, not so much way north Manhattan. But the question is, are cities today losing this capacity to triage conflict? By losing all kinds of capacities and, you know, having to deal with. So Manhattan right now, I know that I still love living in Manhattan, but it is certainly a changed city from what it used to be. We have far more of these towers. You know, I'm using that for shorthand. I think you know what I mean. So the issue is whether some of these cities, I think Paris and London are still very much, they have a totally different organization, if you want. But anyhow, this is a question that we need to ask ourselves. This is an emergent history. We don't have clear answers right now. Now, the second point here, forms of economic growth that kill. For instance, the extreme kinds of economic development since the early 1980s, the stuff that I have already talked about in class, massive growth of inequality, displacement of lower income households, and of low profit enterprises. This stuff is happening all the time in New York. You know, a lot of people are losing ground. They lose their shops, the little shops, the neighborhood shops. They lose their houses because it's too expensive. So loss. And eventually you have a transformed setting. And I would say mid and lower Manhattan are beginning to make that very visible. Unlike northern Manhattan, that's still a little bit different. Pace, the fact, you know that Columbia University, to make its expansion, expelled a whole Dominican community. I don't know if anybody is aware of that. And that was a community, this is a footnote now, that had made an economy for itself. And so Columbia offered, I think I already mentioned this here, haven't I? That Columbia offered housing, better quality housing. It really was better quality housing. But what they didn't realize is that the economy that those people had made was gone. That was a loss. So, you know, it's tricky. Etc., you know, we have a lot of bad situations here. By now you've read this. So here is more still, just read it quickly, please, on emergent, if you want, limits in cities such as Manhattan. Again, I am emphasizing just Manhattan rather than other parts of New York City. You know, to have this capacity to triage conflict, to make the civic out of certain types of urban conflicts rather than military conflicts. You know how that, can the new types of gang wars in Rio de Janeiro and Tijuana is doing better, by the way, be explained simply by ineffective policing and crime, or is there something else that is happening? Truly a loss of ground by too many low-income people that then really does become a different kind of story. Now we go to this first point here. Now let's just focus a bit more on this question of today's wars. The pursuit of national security, this is a proposition. I have done a lot of work on this. You don't have to agree, but you have to, what I do want is that you understand the meaning of that sentence, okay? So the pursuit of national security has in many ways, not in all ways, become the making of urban insecurity. When a military exercises too much control over a city, you're losing urbanity. You feel it, you know, it's not pleasant. The limiting of our basic civic rights, because you are at war. In fact, we have experienced that in New York. When the attack of the towers happened, there were all kinds of things that emerged out of that. Some of them are still around. Other issues where the building, say the United States Embassy in London became notorious. It's a huge embassy. It occupies like a whole block. And they build these huge walls, you know, this super heavy, what do you call that material? Super heavy stones, concrete, these barriers around it. I mean, I don't know if anybody has been in London, but London is the ultimate sort of everything sort of beautiful, connected, well taken care of mostly. And, you know, and there were this, I mean, they militarized it visually. So when you arrived there, you knew, oh my God, this is dangerous. I mean, it literally projected an image of, it must be very dangerous where I'm standing right now. I mean, that is not urban. You know, that de-urbanizes. You will hear me mention this quite a bit. Now, urban space makes the aggressive presence of a conventional army into potentially a terrorizing presence. You know, if you see them out there in a field or in the battlefield on TV, that's one thing. They're not terrorizing. I mean, they may be terrorizing, but they are not visually to the citizen of the country from where they come, you know. But right there in the city, there is something weird that happens. So I live in Lower Manhattan. When the towers were attacked, they closed down the whole lower area. And so you didn't have cars, you didn't have buses, you only had these huge military machines. It was like south of 14th Street, and I live on whatever, in the village there by the park. Huh? So, and the only thing you saw coming down Fifth Avenue were these huge trucks or machines that were actually going to go clean up the world, you know, the site there, or I don't know what they were, maybe they also had guns in them. But it absolutely altered that area of Lower Manhattan. It was different. There were all the buildings, etc., but something crucial had changed. Eventually, of course, that ended. Now, so urban space makes the aggressive presence of a conventional army into a terrorizing presence. We knew, because we saw all these big machines and the emptiness. Huh? The best part was the silence, because there were no cars, no buses, no nothing. But it also made you aware danger. Huh? Because we didn't know what was next after that extraordinary attack, it must be said, of the towers. And so that silence, again, de-urbanized the city, and the city was this space, this ambiguous zone. What's happening here? What's happening? No? Now, this can hold, etc. This can hold even when its purpose is peacekeeping. If you have huge trucks to keep the peace, that can also be weird. It's always a dubious proposition when one side is a fully weaponized actor, like the military. I mean, hey, you know. Like right now, I think the disturbances we have seen, where you have, as you know, many of these police forces now have what is basically military apparel, not typical police force. It just doesn't belong in a city. But the reason I'm emphasizing it is that urban space itself is signaling this does not belong here. And hence, the citizen, the civic eye, says that does not belong here. You know that is wrong. You know you don't want it. And so this is a way of thinking about urban space as having speech. I wrote a little article that I think I put on the syllabus under not required, where I ask a question: does the city have speech? Now, speech as that more elaborate category, not speech as chat. Speech. Speech is like we have speech. We, the citizens, have speech vis-a-vis our government, supposedly. But anyhow, you know. So now, asymmetric war between a conventional army and unconventional armed forces, that is basically asymmetric war, has made cities one side in the map of war making. You understand that, right? So you have had, so the war in Iraq was playing out with our formal, regular army in a very specific area. But there were bombings happening in all kinds of places that were outside the war, the theater of war, strictly speaking. So one argument that one can make is that with asymmetric war, the theater of war involves all kinds of other cities. But it was always cities, because cities have this capacity to make it a visual event that the world can see, so to say, or hear about. So we had all kinds of bombings in places, Casablanca, Bali, London, etc., that really were not the theater of war. There's a very long list of those cities. Now, the many different formats. So these are some of these cities that I mentioned, etc. I just, let's see. That comes about in asymmetric conflict evinces highly variable features. This is very important. You know, it takes on many, many, many different modes. It's not just one mode. It can be an elementary extension of the space of war, the one-shot bombings that you had in London, Madrid, Bali, Casablanca, Mumbai, Lahore, and other cities after the bombing of Iraq was launched. That goes way back now, the bombing of Iraq. But that was a major decision. Do we or do we not bomb Iraq? We bombed Iraq, and out of that came a war that is still not over, basically an asymmetric war. None of those cities was part of the theater of war. So the shadow effect is huge. Any city, and you don't have to be affiliated. So the bombings in Madrid of the train station, that was a terrible bombing. Those were some isolated people who were they were very upset about what was happening. The invasion of Iraq really mobilized a lot of very angry and sort of, if you want, hurt people. None of them was part of the theater of war. So it can be a full extension of the space of war. Iraqi cities after the US-led invasion. Just about all the major cities in Iraq became part of a very active theater of war. And as you know, whatever the Western forces and their allies in those countries still have not recovered fully that terrain. Now, the other thing I think that is important to emphasize that each of these bombings has its own specifics and can be explained in terms of particular grievances and aims. Now, what is the objective? As material practices, the actual practice, what is involved in making it, these are localized actions by local armed groups acting independently from each other. We had a whole rash of such bombings happening after the invasion of Iraq. Yet they are also part of a new kind of multi-sided war, a distributed and variable set of actions. You know, the bombings in Madrid were radically different from some of the other things that were happening in various cities. A distributed and variable set of actions that gain larger meaning. Little action gains huge meaning. One person, like in Paris we've had a few of those, right? One person generates a bit of a whatever that kills 3 people in that spirit of, terrorizing, and it reverberates really across a much larger space. So it's an invariable set of actions that gain larger meaning from a specific conflict with global projection, such as was the war in Iraq. I would say that the invasion of Iraq was one of the huge historic errors, and I think more and more experts are saying that. The shadow effect that it generated was just enormous. The death, the maiming of people, it was just a terrible war. Now, the other thing we must ask, is this kind of urbanizing of war different from what happened in the past? After all, we had World War I and World War II. They were extraordinarily destructive wars. We killed millions of people. By we, I mean we the people of the world. We, whatever, not we the people, not quite. That is sort of has another meaning, but you know what I mean. We, these Western societies, military, etc. Now, the question is, World War I and World War II killed a lot of people. Is there a difference between that war and these wars that we have? So in older wars, there large armies needed, large open fields or oceans. Basically, the bigger your army, you were not going to go crawl into a city. It was airspace, land space, water space. So World War I and World War II are really different in terms of the material practices and the spaces where those wars deployed. So in World War I, the city and World War II entered the war theater not as a site for making war, but as a technology for instilling fear, okay? The full destruction, and these were very rare cases. The famous Dresden case, you all know about that, right? German city that was just the United States. The war had basically been settled. But the United States decided, like they did with Hiroshima. Those were when the war was actually almost finishing. They decided to do a firebombing that was, and I think they were also experimenting with the tools, because they were continuously inventing new elements, but as a technology for instilling fear. So let's make an end to this war, etc. Let's just terrorize them. Out of that comes Hiroshima, and of course the other city, and then also this Dresden. Dresden, in the European field, Dresden is almost, one could say, in this World War II, a unique event. This is very important. That's quite different from today, because the theater of war was a very different theater of war. So today, most of the small terrorist attacks, they happen in cities. Because the city, as I said at the beginning, the whole world will find out. Now, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki are these standout events. As you know, and if you don't know, you should know, many people told the Americans, do not bomb the Japanese cities, because we have won. It was like at the edge, and they did it. And of course, I think it was a tragic error. It didn't resolve anything, because the war was finished. The rationale was always, okay, this will make an end, and then we save all the other next lives. But in the case of those two cities, not. In the case of Dresden, there is more of a debate. But what I want to emphasize, that was a world war, a global space. Only 3 cities were given this treatment. Today, all kinds of cities are in play, not at that level of destruction, but they are these critical sites. So there is sort of, if you want, one of the differences. The other thing that stands out with asymmetric war is the limits of military superiority. Okay, so you have a superior army. It will get you only so far. And I told you earlier, so now the United States has these encampments that, like in the case of Fallujah, it like reproduced Fallujah. So little, how do you call it? Little passages, little old buildings, because that was the kind of, theater of war that they had to learn about. Now, can the countries with the most powerful conventional armies today afford to repeat Dresden with firebombs or Hiroshima with an atomic bomb, whether in Baghdad, Gaza, or Syria? I am not going to give you my answer to that, but I invite you to think about it. The stuff that I'm talking about, is happening also today. It is happening. But, yeah, I leave you with that. So, soft power. There has been a lot of talk about soft power. How many of you have heard of this concept of soft power? I would have think. Okay, so those of you who haven't heard, soft power as opposed to hard power. Hard power, you kill them, you bomb them, etc. Soft power, you negotiate, you settle, etc., etc. The role of the civic, of law, of the growing global web of interdependencies that exist in the world to contest absolute military superiority. In other words, soft power is a power that you have that allows you, so only some countries have it, only some actors really have it, that allows you to contest superior military force and to say, I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to do it this other way. Now, we see a bit of that. But I would say the Syria war was a case where people were really trying to do that. Didn't work very well. I think you know that. That was a war that is still going on. But still, I think it matters. It matters that we have these other modes. And so one way then of extracting, if you want, a positive condition out of this is to say that it shows, soft power shows, that under certain conditions, powerlessness, you're not the most powerful, can become complex. And by that I mean an ambiguous condition that allows those without power to be part of the conversation, part of the negotiation, to be recognized, to have a certain kind of standing, even though it still leaves ambiguous, what's the outcome? Do you actually succeed, in changing the outcome? I find that in today's world, it's a tough one. I think that soft power is an intermediation. Its effect is in altering existing laws, in signing treaties with the hope, say, with the treaty with Iran. That was a major event that now, of course, is threatened by the current president of the United States. So soft power also indicates a capacity to restrain that is not military. All right? So it does not derive from military power. The fact itself of cities becoming a frontline war space can be a constraint to too much militarizing, too much killing, too much destruction. So the city, in that context of soft power, the city is actually a space that can say, not here, go do it out there, but not here, for good or for bad, because who knows what the other one is. And so here are a few other, other constraints that I already alluded to. The fact that in a working city, when you have a very aggressive military presence, you say, no, that doesn't belong here. It's just a speech of those machines, those killer machines, machines to kill in the urban space. It's just no. We can't forget that. We can't forget, no, you don't belong here. That is speech also. Again, this notion of speech, in the richest sense of that term. Urban space makes the aggressive presence of a conventional army into a terrifying presence. That's how it should be. No, not here. No. Think of you are there with a child and you say, no. Now, in other settings, Congo and the 6 million killed, no, it doesn't have that effect. There is there is an issue of voice, etc. there. This can hold even when its purpose is peacekeeping. The famous tanks to keep the peace. That happened in Iraq too. Always a dubious proposition when one side is a fully weaponized actor. So the city sort of is a space that resists and should resist the military presence. Now, I just wanted to show you, this go on and on and on, so these are interesting images. You know what I'm talking about here or not? This is Tahrir Square. So masses of people repositioning the meaning of a tank. Now, we know that the story ended very badly. Not this particular, but many, like a year later, so much was lost. But that was a moment when the role of the armed forces became so ambiguous that they did not conduct themselves as active militarized machines for killing or stopping something. And you have the images of putting flowers in the tank, etc. And I have this other one that you already saw. There is the tank, etc. But people do those who want to pray, etc. Now, the question of Tahrir Square, as you know, ended very, very badly. But there was a period there where the possibility emerged of a way of handling the military that actually neutralized that power, that other versions of what's next appeared. I would say when the current regime came in, that's where it really changed. This has been an extremely, I think part of the violence of this regime was precisely the impact of this social form that emerged, where people from many, many different parts of Cairo sort of got together, where many of the military joined them, And then you have a regime that lasted for a year that was more or less, I thought, reasonable. And then you have the current regime. So it got very, very messy. But I just want to leave you with this image because in a way, this shows the power of the Civic in its many instantiations over the tank. The tank almost looks silly. What is it doing there? That's how it should be, I think, in urban space.